The principles of collectivism. So when we look at individualism and collectivism, we look at them separately because they are literally at the opposite ends of each other's spectrum. They are so far from like each other, as you can even see in the key principles right away. We're talking about economic equality, not economic freedom. So equality in this case is going to refer to the fact that freedoms are taken away to serve the whole. This is where the foundations of communism and socialism come from, which I'm sure is quite clear, or will be clear as we go on here. Okay, but the important thing to know is that yes, they are at opposite ends of the spectrum, certainly in their origin. But as I mentioned in the first lesson, they blend together very well when we talk about modern liberalism. So it is important for us to understand how they differ and are on opposite ends of each other, but we will see that they are quite similar or that they can function together as we move through this unit. So the first, obviously these key principles that we want to look at, we're going to be looking at economic equality, cooperation, public property, collective interest, collective responsibilities, and adherence to collective norms. A lot of that word collective, cooperation, and public are going to be very common when we talk about collectivism. This is a video by Milton Friedman, who is a proponent of liberalism. So when you watch this video, if you want to watch this video, it's not like you'll be tested on it or anything, but it will give you a little bit more of a perspective of the opposition to collectivism and why some of the principles that apply to collectivism don't work in his opinion. He refers a lot to the Soviet Union and the things that are going there. That's when this was presented, I think it was in 1976. So right in the heart of the Cold War, which we'll learn about more in Unit 2. And we're talking about communism and the failures of communism because they don't reject the concepts of liberalism quite the way people think they do. Okay, so the first thing we're going to start with is the idea of economic equality. Okay, economic equality refers to the idea that we're trying to keep everybody's progress and everybody's prosperity in the same realm. Because the idea is if one person tends to be more successful than the other, then you start to have an inequality that results in a more favored approach. So those who are successful continue to be successful and those who aren't continue to fall behind. So there's ways of attaining that. Progressive taxation is the idea that if a person makes more money, they are taxed more. Now, a lot of people would see that that doesn't really sound fair, especially in a liberal society, because if somebody's working harder, they should be paid more. But progressive taxation is intended to keep people in the same playing field. So yes, you can work harder and you can be more successful and enjoy that, but you will be taxed more, and those taxes will be used for the benefit of everyone else. And so there is some good there because everybody is sharing in the benefit of hard work no matter what. So it really depends on how you look at it. A lot of modern perspectives are that those that make a lot of money are actually taxed very little, especially in a Republican government in the United States. Something that you'll find out has a lot to do with Ronald Reagan, but it is a policy that still is practiced very much today in the Republican Party. Okay. All of that kind of depends on what the government is looking for at the time. Okay, so really right now with Obama's administration, which is a Democratic administration, that is really not something that exists very much right now. Now, guaranteed annual income is a novel concept that actually our Green Party, the Green Party of Canada, believes very much in. Is that due to taxation, every single citizen is guaranteed a certain amount of money just for being a citizen every single year. That would mean that everybody is meeting the basic standard of living or quality of life, okay, which creates happier people, which means that there's less civil unrest. Okay, you can get more done because there's more productivity because people are happier. Now, it's a novel concept, but what that means is that those who are working are paying for those who may not be. So that's a really difficult concept to understand. Sharing the wealth is the idea that as a nation becomes prosperous and is making money, they start to share that money with its citizens. Seems to make sense, especially if you look at it like they're paying for parks or if they're paying for roads and things like that. Everybody shares that way. But this idea is the actual idea of sharing income with its citizens. So if a nation is wealthy, then they share it. Now, that might actually sound familiar to say something that a company might do. If a company makes money, they might share that with their employees, which sounds pretty awesome, but actually most companies don't do that. The ones that do tend to see happier and more successful employees, such as those that work at Google, okay, who are always benefiting from the wealth of their business, so they're always encouraged to improve and do better for their business. Okay, but of course a lot of nations would have trouble with that, because sharing the wealth does not always mean that the citizens are going to spend it in that nation. For example, if somebody lives half the year in the United States to avoid the snow, well, then all of that money is going to the United States. So there are definitely some issues with that, and why that one tends not to work very well. The people own the means of production. Now, what that really means, when we say the people, we mean the government. The government owns the means of production, meaning that anything that is able to produce something of value, whether it's agriculture or it's manufacturing and so on, it is the government's property. And so they can decide what it's used for, when it's used for, and so on. This is an idea that comes from Karl Marx. That's the original founder of communism, because he believed that only when the people make the choices about what is produced, how it's produced, and for who, then we actually have a happy society. But as soon as individuals start making that decision, that falls apart. That is in direct contrast with economic freedom from individualism, because the idea is that people only produce stuff that people actually want and would buy. Which actually makes sense. If somebody is building a product that nobody wants, the business will fail. That happens all the time. So it actually balances itself out. So it's tough to say which is better here. I would say history would prove that when people or the government own the means of production, they tend to produce weapons, which tends to happen more often, and you'll see that when we talk about communist Russia. No private property is the exact same idea. All property belongs to the state and can be taken and used as they see fit. Now, if you totally trust your government and believe that they are going to allow you to live on a piece of land and leave you alone, that sounds like that actually could be a pretty great deal, because then no one person owns more property than others and then therefore are more powerful. Sounds pretty great. And that was definitely something people in 1917 in Russia were interested in, since the only person who owned any land at all was, in fact, the king or the Tsar at the time, of which they had no desire to keep going. So, of course, they had a revolution and kicked them out. Okay, in the case of modern society, that's not so great. If you look at the people in China who were displaced, moved out of their home because they didn't own their property, so that they can build a stadium for the 2008 Olympics, I'm sure they had a bit of a problem with this idea. Cooperation is an idea, or is a concept that exists in collectivism, but can exist in liberalism too. What ends up happening here in cooperation is when we talk about when individuals come together and actually work as a group to achieve something that, well, obviously here it says to achieve common goals, but it might also be to fulfill a need that is otherwise not served by a single individual. So what this means is that there will be behaviors that are decided upon, which also kind of become quite rigid. And you'll see that more when we talk about adherence to a group. Okay, because in order for this to work, we need to have a set pattern of behaviors and so on. So what that might mean is something like credit unions, healthcare, or daycare centers that involve people that are grouped together. They have their own board that is elected, and that the decisions are made as a group and as a collective, so that they can fulfill a goal or a need that's definitely there. So the idea of credit unions talks about people that are in opposition to big banks that tend to make the decisions for their money for them. So a credit union, and some of you may actually belong to a credit union, are actually locally owned businesses usually that collective groups that have an elected board and have people that are hired to work by that board and then serve their needs. So that might mean they invest their money based on what they choose as a group or as a collective. Now, you may be in a credit union and are thinking, I've never had any say in any of that. Well, you'd be surprised how much you do if you actually voiced it and went to the bank and spoke to the people involved. Healthcare is much the same. We're talking about elected boards that sit on these boards and make the decisions about where we need to go for health and our health concerns. So hiring of doctors, opening up hospitals, but then also just about how we educate and medicate our people. Okay, big part of it. So cooperation is a big part of collectivism, but actually something you see in a liberal society all the time now, and we'll talk about that more as we go on. Public property is a big concern when they talk about collectivism. Public property is the idea that anything that is of value to the public belongs to the public. Okay, some ideologies have taken this extremely serious. Others have kind of lightened up on it. I would say modern China, yes, they own mostly public property, but they do have a lot of different ways that they provide property to individuals so that they can thrive and increase the economy of the nation. Canada itself uses a lot of public property through its idea of crown corporations. Canada is a vast, very large country. In order to serve a broadcasting corporation from one coast to the other, certainly in the beginning stages of our nation, it needed to be owned by the government because likely it would not be a successful business. It would fail. And no private industry would want to take on a failing business. So in order to provide that service for its citizens, it needed to tax its people and then use that taxation to provide that service. Via Rail is an example of another industry that still exists today, that is a crown corporation, and it provides obviously the rail service for its citizens. But since it charges so little and costs so much to operate, it is technically a failing business, and therefore the government needs to subsidize it and pay for it, and that makes it public property. The next 3 points, collective interest, and when we talked about adherence to a group and so on, when we talk about these next 3 points, what we're really referring to is the ideological stance of collectivism. So this is the idea that interests the group has in common and want to achieve. So kind of the same as a collective goal, but or a cooperation. But collective interest is something that is represented in a lot of different ways, and again can exist in liberal societies. So a labor union is a good example of a collective interest because it's a group that supports that common goal, and it is that group that actually stands for the goals of that group. Okay, so you might see that also in human rights groups and in lobby groups. Okay, but a collective interest is also something that a government that is a collective government might hide behind and make it seem like it is that interest above all interests because it's speaking on behalf of the people. And that could be accurate or it could be inaccurate depending on sometimes the government makes it seem like they're acting in the interest of the group, but really they're acting in the interest of what's best for themselves as a government. That happens all the time. Collective responsibility is the idea that we all share within that group, and so that we are all responsible for the actions of those individuals, which could mean that we are all held accountable. Now you see this a lot in times of, say, when there's a terrorist attack in September 11th, 2001, and suddenly our transportation laws change greatly. We were not terrorists. Most of us, and I would say 99.999% of the population had no desire to harm its nation. But because of the actions of the few and because of the devastation of the actions of those few, we could all be held accountable. Now this is very much a practice in countries that are collective countries because they try and make sure that they reinforce the idea that what's best for the group. Okay, so as I said here, behaviors of governments can be excused as what's good for the group. And so in North Korea, for example, if you commit a crime, it is possible that you would be punished severely, but in addition to that, your children or your closest relatives may also be charged with that crime and serve just the same type of sentence that you would, which in some cases could be death. But in a disturbing way, your children may also serve time in prisons and so on as a part of those actions. 3 generations of punishments exist in North Korea and some other countries too, to really emphasize the greater good. So if your actions detriment the society as a whole, then all will pay for it, as to send a message that it is not acceptable. So as we said, though, it does address larger societal problems. So if we say that shootings in public buildings continue to rise, so laws start to change in terms of who can carry a gun and when, and we start to enact some gun control, we're addressing larger societal problems through that. Now, we don't always address them in the right way, so, increasing sentences for those who are selling drugs does not address the fact that people are using drugs. So sometimes we might not address them in the right way, but we're still trying to address those, and that's through collective responsibility. The most common feature within collective governments is the idea of adherence to collective norms. Now, norms are those rules and those regulations that are established by those officials, those people that have been kind of given that ability to do so, that everyone must adhere to. So obviously those some can be written, some could be clearly defined, others could be not written, okay, and they can kind of just be expected of you no matter what. And that's just, they're considered binding, which means if you are part of this collective, you will adhere to these. And that is something that's always mentioned. So you may have heard of a story or read the story maybe when you were in language arts sometime, called The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. The Lottery is a story about a community of people who every year hold a lottery, and the winner of that lottery is publicly stoned to death. The story itself goes off as if this is just something everybody does. They just wake up that particular day, go to the center of town, gather some stones, do a lottery, stone someone to death. There is almost no mention of why or what the point of this is. No one seems to question it until, of course, somebody pulls the black mark and they are the one that will be stoned to death. And it's never questioned at all, because that is the idea of a collective and adhering to a norm. It just becomes so commonplace and it just becomes so normal that very few people actually take time to really think about what that means. Okay? And that could include censorship. So a government could make some decisions about what is presented and why, and so it can kind of keep in mind that they're thinking about the better of their society. Okay? And people are often just fine with that. They just accept that, and that is just normal for them. Okay, so that is the end of this video. I noticed that I went a little long. Again, I'm going to try and keep these short, but feel free, of course, as you're listening to these, to skip to whatever you need to at any time. But they are further explained, and there's a reason for that. However, if you ever have any more questions, you can always just send a message to me or call me up, or anything you want to do to find out what I'm truly meaning by this. Okay, thank you.